Hello friends! Welcome to Coding Garden with CJ. Tonight's episode, an introduction to TypeScript and Angular 5. Hello. All right, let's get into this. So if you attempted to tune in last week, you might have saw nothing because I forgot to press start last week. But today I remembered, and here we are. We're live. You're watching me. And yeah, so last time I actually basically sort of learned TypeScript in Angular 5 for no one. I was doing it because nobody was watching because I forgot to press start. So this time, it will be somewhat more of a tutorial because I am familiar with it, but let's get right into it. So Angular 5 is a front-end framework, but one of the prerequisites, or one of the things they use in Angular 5 is a language called TypeScript. So first we're going to review the basics of TypeScript before we jump into building a simple app with Angular 5. Aaron, what's up? Oh, thanks for joining. That's great. Okay, so first, what is TypeScript? On the Wikipedia page, it says TypeScript is an open source programming language developed and maintained by Microsoft. It is a strict syntactical superset of JavaScript and adds optional static typing to the language. So an important keyword here is superset. And what this means is all valid JavaScript is actually valid TypeScript. So technically, you could just keep writing JavaScript in a TypeScript file and you'd be totally fine. Of course, you wouldn't be getting any of the benefits of using TypeScript, but that is something to note, that TypeScript is essentially more features on top of JavaScript, and you can already use the JavaScript you know and love. It's just going to add a little things on top. So TypeScript was actually created by Anders Hellsberg, who is the lead architect and creator of the C# language, and you can really think of TypeScript as if C# and JavaScript had a baby. So it basically makes it so that you write JavaScript, but you actually declare your types, which is something as a JavaScript developer you're probably not used to. Some more info on this. Interesting note, TypeScript 1 was released at Microsoft's Build Developer Conference in 2014. I was there. I actually saw the talk that Anders gave, showing off the new features of TypeScript. And another thing to point out in what TypeScript is this optional static typing to the language. So if you're familiar with JavaScript, you can define variables, but you don't have to specify their type. You define a variable, you just throw whatever you want into it. But with TypeScript, when you define a variable, you can say, this variable will only ever contain a number. And if you attempt to put something else in there, you will get a compile error, and your code won't even get turned into JavaScript. It'll basically say, you need to fix this, and then you'll have to fix it. But let's see some of the basic features. If you go to their website, typescriptlang.org, they show you how to install it. This will install the TypeScript command, and will make it available to you on your terminal. I did this last time when nobody was watching, so I already have it installed. But if you run that command, you will get the TypeScript compiler from your command line. So this will give you this TSC command. Let's take a look at some of the basic features, and first take a look at basic types. So essentially the syntax looks like this. You define your variable, colon, and then you give it the type of the variable, and then you can assign it some value. So here we have booleans can have values, numbers, just like in JavaScript, numbers are floating point numbers. Strings, just like in JavaScript, you can use single quotes or double quotes. You just have to be consistent. And also backticks, if you're familiar with the ES 2015 syntax. And then also arrays. So if you're defining an array, in JavaScript, you could define an array and put all different types in there. You could have a string and an object and a number and a boolean in there. But in TypeScript, when you create an array, you create it of just a single type. Let's just code some of this up. So basic overview of what TypeScript is. Now let's kind of get into the types and see it in action. So I'm going to create a types.ts file. So all of your TypeScript files have a .ts extension. And we're going to write some code. So let name and name is going to be a string, and the value is going to be coding garden. And one of the oh, actually, I think name is I figured this out last time. It's an invalid variable in TypeScript. Well, we'll call this a stream name. Yo, Derek, thanks for tuning in. Thank you very much. Stream name, let's call it that. Okay, so I've defined a variable, and then let's just log it out. Stream name, like that. And let's run our code. So to run our code, we first have to transpile it. And the idea is the TypeScript compiler will turn this TypeScript code into JavaScript code, and then the JavaScript code is what will actually run in Node or in your browser or something like that. So you do TSC and then the name of the file, and that will generate a JavaScript file. So if we look at types.js, we can actually see what it generated. And essentially, it got rid of the typing and just turned it into a var. This code works exactly the same way, but this is just how we would write the same code with JavaScript. And so now to run the code, I'm just going to use node, types.js, and it prints out the name of the stream. Very cool. But one of the things that this offers you as a developer is now that we've explicitly declared the type of this variable, we can't put anything else in it. So if I were to attempt to put, let's say, a boolean in this variable, I have the TypeScript language installed in Atom, and it will actually show you the compile error that you're going to get. It says type true is not assignable to type string. So if I attempt to write my code like this, it's actually going to throw a compiler error. And so now if I try to compile it again, we get that same error. However, I do believe, yeah, it actually still transpiles it. We just get this error in the console. So technically, I could still take this code and run it somewhere, like in Node. Let's do that. And it still works. But TypeScript is trying to warn us and saying, hey, you declared the types, but you tried to put something else in there. So that's great. And just looking at the docs, pretty basic stuff for defining all of your basic types. And I guess I'll show real quick with creating arrays. So let's call this numbers. And notice the syntax for this is the type that's going to be in the array and then brackets. So this basically says numbers is an array that can only hold the number type inside of it. And we could log that out. Numbers. And if we run this code, so let's do that. And just to make this easy, basically this says compile and then run the code. Oh no. Oh, sorry, types.js. So compile the code and then run the file. And there we go, it logged out our array. But just like you saw me trying to assign a boolean to a string, if I attempt to push something that's not a number into this array, like a string, we're going to get a compile error that says wow is not assignable to a parameter of type number. So pretty basic stuff. Let's look at some other features of TypeScript. So we saw all the basic types. Let's talk about interfaces. Okay, in JavaScript, if you've been coding in JavaScript for a while, you probably use objects. And you might be thinking, well, if I want to declare an object variable, maybe I can just do let person and then like object maybe. That might actually work, I don't know. But because we have strict typing, we want to be able to describe what actually is inside of that object. So what properties does it have? And this is where interfaces come into play. So interfaces are essentially just a description of the properties that an object or a class is going to have. So I'm going to write some basic code here. We're going to refactor it into more of like a command line to-do app. But let's say I want to have an array of objects that represent to-do items. So for this, I would define an interface to describe each of the items in my array. So I'm going to describe an interface. So I'm going to do interface. Let's call this to-do item. And we're going to say a to-do item has a title that is a string. I believe that's the way to do it. Yep. And then it's also going to have an isDone property that is a boolean. And now what we've just done is we've described the interface for an object that's going to be in our to-do items array. Basically, every object in the array must have a title that's a string and must have an isDone property that is a Boolean. Now, in the docs, they also show that you can use this question mark syntax, and basically that says this property is optional, so the object may or may not have that property, but by leaving that off, this means that every object must have these two properties. So if I were to say something like let items be an array of to-do item, so I'm going to do to-do item brackets, and now this items array can only take objects that adhere to this interface. So if I want to push something into the array, I'd have to do create an object, has a title property of like learn TypeScript, has an isDone of false, and notice I'm not getting any linter errors right now because that adheres to the interface. But if I remove the title, now we get an error. It says argument of type object with isDone property is not assignable to parameter of type to do item. Property title is missing in the type. Now this is a really good error to get as a developer because every now and then you might be defining an object and maybe you misspelled a property or you forgot a property. So the TypeScript compiler is actually going to tell you exactly what you did wrong. Let's run this on the command line to see what error we actually do get. Same error, but essentially we're attempting to put this object in the array, but it doesn't match the interface. So the moment we add back the title property, it does match the interface and the code will actually run. Cool. And yeah, that's pretty much the basics of interfaces. A little more advanced feature is you can specify properties as read-only, meaning if you attempt to overwrite them or update their value, you will get a compiler error that says this property is read-only. But yeah, that's it for interfaces. Let's move on to classes. So if you're familiar with ES 2015, TypeScript uses essentially the exact same syntax, only it allows you to define the properties that your class is going to have on the class itself. So let's get rid of that, and let's go ahead and create a new TypeScript file and call it todolist.ts. And so I'm going to define a class called todolist, and this class is going to have an array of items. So I'm going to say items, and this is of type to-do item array. So essentially, I'm going to encapsulate that array of to-do items into a class so we can create methods that allow us to add items to the to-do list, mark things as done, that kind of thing. So that's there, but inside of this file, I actually need access to the to-do item interface. So I'm just going to go ahead and define it in this file for now, but in a moment, I'm going to show you modules where we can actually define things in separate files. So now this interface is defined in the same file. We're defining a class saying it has a property called items. And we can actually initialize this. Let's just say it's an empty array. And then now let's create an instance of this class. So let's say list equals new to-do list. And then we have access to list dot, and that's my break timer. So take a quick break, look away from the screen, take a stretch. And here is another aspect and feature of TypeScript. So notice right here, the editor is telling me exactly what properties are available to me. So this isn't just a dumb autocompletion in that it sees that it's in the same file. Because TypeScript is strictly typed, it knows exactly what properties are available to me and can be really intelligent as to what it suggests. So it knows that I have this property called items, and we can modify it. Let's say we push an object into it. So title, learn TypeScript, is done is false, and that works. Everything is right with the world. So that's great and all, but what if we want to not allow direct access to this property? So typically when you're working with object-oriented programming, you encapsulate things. That is, you hide them from the outside world so that if the internal implementation changes, the outside world doesn't have to know about that. They can just go on doing what they've been doing because you've defined some sort of way to interact with this array. So instead of allowing the outside world to push directly into this array, let's add a method like add to do. And I believe on my list I am going to be talking about, I have functions here. So a function takes in parameters, and you can also declare the types of the parameters. So here I can say new to do, and its type is to do item. So when we're calling the add to do function, it will accept an object that adheres to the to do item interface. Cool. The other thing is for functions, you can declare what their return type is. So in my case, I'm going to declare that this returns a number. So essentially, I'm going to return the new length of the array, or of the internal array, after we add something to the array. And so inside of this method, I can say this.items.push, and we'll push in the new to do. Cool. Notice this is complaining. It says a function whose declared type is neither void nor any must return a value. So we essentially need to return a number, and I'm just going to return this.items.length. So whenever you add a new to do, we just return the length of the array. Cool. And so now, instead of directly pushing into the array, we can just call the add to do method, and that will work in exactly the same way. But now we can use another feature of TypeScript and of object-oriented programming, and that is hide this array. Because even though I created this method, the outside world still has access to items. I could still come down here and log list.items. And let's run this code. So we'll do tsc to do list.typescript and then run it with node. To do list.js. Cool. So the outside world still has access to that items array. But if we want to change that, we can use access modifiers. And those are similar to any other object-oriented programming language you've used, like Java or C#. You have public, private, and protected. So a public property is accessible to the world, and when you declare a property, it's public by default. There are also private properties, and a private property can only be accessed from inside of the class. And then a protected property can only be accessed by any class that inherits or relates to this class. So essentially, when I define this, by default, it's public. So I am going to declare this as private. And now we will not be able to access items from outside, from the outside world. So if I were to attempt to log list.items, the error I'm getting, property items is private and only accessible within class to-do list. So essentially, I'm using encapsulation to prevent the outside world from directly modifying this array, and they have to call my add to-do method in order to even interface with that class. So just these little things sprinkled on top of JavaScript makes your code potentially easier to understand, easier to follow, and less prone to bugs. Because by defining types everywhere, if you accidentally do the wrong thing, the TypeScript compiler is going to yell at you. Whereas in JavaScript, it'll just let it happen, and eventually you'll get some runtime error in the browser or something like that. I believe the last thing I'm going to show is modules. So if you're familiar with ES 2015, import-export syntax, or you've worked extensively with React or even Angular or the latest version of Vue, you're probably familiar with import syntax, and you can do the exact same thing inside of TypeScript. So essentially, we can define things in separate files and then bring them into other files in order to clean up our code and make it a little more manageable. So let's do this. Let's create a file called todoitem.ts. And inside of that file is where I'm going to define this interface. But now that the interface is over here, I need to bring it into this file. And to do that, I have to export this interface. So I'm going to do export default. And essentially what this means is when another file imports this file, they're going to get this interface by default. So now in this file, if I close it, it should throw an error saying, it's not throwing an error. Yeah, okay, there it is. So cannot find name to do item because we removed it from this file. But I can bring it back in by just importing it. So if I import to do item from to do item, this now will bring in that interface that I defined, and we have access to it inside of here. And then the other thing is, instead of using the class in the same file that I defined it, let's pull that out of here and then create another file. Let's call it like runner.ts. Throw our code in there, but now we need access to the to-do list class inside of this file, so we can just import it. So I'll do import to-do list from to-do list, but remember we have to export it. This is telling me, it's saying module to-do list has no default export. So if we go back to the file, we need to say export default to-do list, and now to-do list is available to the outside world, and in this file we can actually use it. Let's try again. Cool. And so now let's so right now I have a bunch of JS files in here. Let's remove all of the JavaScript files. Cool. And so now I believe if I compile runner.ts, it's automatically going to see that it needs to compile all of the other files, and it automatically compiles to-do item and to-do list into their JavaScript file. Just also as a caveat, you might hear me say compile or transpile. To be technically correct, this is transpilation. So it's taking code written in TypeScript and transpiling it down to JavaScript. Now, a lot of people will just use the terms interchangeably, as I am doing. They sort of kind of mean the same thing, but not really. Hopefully you forgive me for using that word. But regardless, I have compiled it, and now we can run it. So if I do a node runner.js, oh, we're not logging anything, but ultimately our code runs, we can create the class, we can add to-do items to it. That is the basic functionality of TypeScript and really the extent of what we need to know to kind of get started with Angular. Anybody watching in the chat, any questions, comments? Thank you, Subin. She says, CJ is an MVP. Appreciate you. Cool. And as I mentioned, I'll throw these links in the chat. TypeScriptlang.org has everything you need to get started. And yeah, check out the Wikipedia page too to read about it. But if there are no questions, I am going to get on to Angular 5. Cool. Actually, okay, I did not update my to-do list from last time. Let's do that. Okay, we have done nothing. Okay, so first, what is Angular 5? Angular 5 is a front-end framework. It is backed by Google. They have core developers working at Google that are solely working on the Angular 5 project. Let's take a look at their website. It is angular.io. One framework for mobile and desktop. Speed and performance. Incredible tooling. Loved by millions. Sure. Cool. Let's go ahead and get into the brief history of Angular because I'm actually kind of salty about it. So Angular.io is the latest version of Angular, Angular 5, but you might also come across angularjs.org. And this is Angular version 1x, or what you'll hear people refer to as Angular 1x. And actually, let's look this up on Wikipedia because there's an interesting history to it. So Angular 1 was initially released 7 years ago. That's like a million years in JavaScript time. So it was initially released in 2010 and gained incredible popularity. Tons of enterprises and projects used Angular 1. They loved it. It was a great improvement over the imperative procedural code of the jQuery and vanilla DOM days. It made working on the front end fantastic. But pretty soon, not pretty soon after that, but eventually things like React came along, and they totally changed the way that front-end frameworks work by introducing this idea of the virtual DOM. And Angular quickly wanted to catch up, so they decided that in Angular version 2, it was going to be a complete rewrite to no longer do the things the way they were doing them. And yes, and so this happened in 2014. So in 2014, they began working on Angular proper, which was it originally Angular 2 and now Angular 5. Now the thing about it though, and so Angular 1 was great. I wrote apps in production for close to 5 years using Angular 1. It's a beautiful thing. It made me love front-end JavaScript development. But then the Angular platform came along and had a bit of a bumpy road. And so essentially, Angular 2 was a complete and total rewrite of Angular. The syntax is new. The code base is totally new. It essentially just carries the Angular name. Now, initially, Angular 2 was announced in September of 2014. But as ultimately they announced it way too early because they started releasing alphas and developer previews and release candidates. And with each of these new releases, it was still labeled as version 2, but there were breaking changes. And so for a while, between like 2016, maybe early 2017, if you were to search for an Angular 2 tutorial online, it might be broken, or you might try to do something that has totally changed in the latest version of the framework. And ultimately, that left a really bad taste in my mouth, and I have not touched Angular since that happened because it was just a giant mess. But ultimately, they sort of kind of got their shit together, and a final version was released, and it started to get stable. And in December of 2016, they released Angular version 4. They actually skipped version 3 because they didn't want to confuse versioning with their router. But version 2 is technically backward compatible with Angular 2. I could keep talking. You could just peruse this and see how confusing everything is. Ultimately, here we are today, March 7th, 2018. We are at Angular version 5. And the dust has somewhat settled because now if you're searching for information on Angular 5, you will find information on Angular 5 and it won't be confusing or outdated. That said, the AngularJS documentation is extremely extensive. If you want to figure out how to do something, you can pretty much find it in the docs. Along with a total rewrite of Angular, they also introduced a CLI tool. So in the Angular 1 days, one Angular 1 app might not look like another Angular 1 app because ultimately you could kind of put files where you wanted and do what you wanted to do. The John Papa style guide did come along, which, if people followed it, made the code more approachable and more consistent across code bases. But now that the Angular team has introduced the CLI tool, pretty much every Angular 4, Angular 5 app you come across is going to be organized in the same way and using the same tools and things like that. I talked through my break timer, but hopefully you looked away from the screen. Cool. I have probably been talking about this way too long. Let's just write some Angular. So, but a quick note though, if you are attempting to learn Angular 5, make sure you're on angular.io and not on angularjs.org. Cool, there was my rant and a brief history of Angular. Let's get into it. So if you go to the Getting Started on Angular, they talk about how to install the CLI tool. So just like Vue.js has the Vue CLI, Ember has the Ember CLI, React has Create React App, Angular 5 has a CLI tool that you can install and generate a project. So I've already installed it, but if you run this command, you'll get the CLI tool, and the command is actually ng. So let's create a new app. So in this directory, I'm going to do ng app Oh, sorry, ng new to do app. Siddharth asks, which app do you use for the break on your screen? I use an app called Timeout. Timeout? Yeah, by Deja. It's super cool. You can set your micro breaks and your longer breaks. I have micro breaks set for every 15 minutes. Ultimately, when that 10-second timer pops up, I just make sure I remove my hands from the keyboard to prevent any sort of RSI or anything like that. And then every 60 minutes, I have a 5-minute timer come up, and I'll attempt to take a break, walk away from my computer or something like that. But it's a great tool. I am a 12-month supporter because you get a few extra features, and I use this thing extensively. So I highly recommend that app. Wow, and Angular still installing and generating. So this one command, ng new, and then you give the name of your app, will create a project directory and then initialize it with unit tests, end-to-end tests. It'll hook everything up for you, and you'll be ready to go. Okay, so that happened. I believe it also did an npm install to install all of my dependencies. And let's take a look at this in Atom. So we installed the CLI, we generated an Angular app, and this is what we get. Now ultimately, just like most other generated projects, there's a lot of configuration files in here that initially you probably won't have to touch. But there is a CLI config, protractor, which is testing for Angular, a TypeScript config, a linting config, Karma, which is unit testing, I believe. And then it also generates this end-to-end testing folder. But the things you care about and we'll be working on are in the source directory. A lot of files in here. Ultimately, main.ts is the entry point into our Angular application. You'll notice we're bringing in some libraries from Angular, and then this one line right here is bringing in the top-level module that they created for us, and then bootstrapping it on the app. There's some other files in here. Styles.css is a global styles file, so any styles you put in here will be applied to your entire application. Some other stuff, some polyfills we don't really have to worry about, and then there's also index.html. So similar to React and Vue, your HTML is super simple. It's just a basic HTML, and then you have one element where the entire app is going to live inside of. In our case, it's called app root. And if we take a look inside the app folder at app.module, you'll see that it is, again, bringing in some core libraries, but then it's bringing in this app component. And the app component defines its selector as app root. So this is essentially the topmost component in our app, and this is what's going to be mounted on that div when the app starts up. A component has a selector, that is how you add it to the page. It has a template, that's all of your HTML, and potential handlebars and bindings to your component data. And then you can also have a style file that's specific to this one component. Our component has a property defined on it called title set to app. And if we look at the HTML, you'll see these handlebars or mustache templates that will actually render the value of title into that element. If we look back in this module file, a lot of other stuff going on here. Ultimately, the fact that our component is there makes it available and working right there. Enough talk, let's see this thing in action. So the command for that is ng-serve --open. This will start up a development server, which will serve up our app, and then as we change and save and update files, it will automatically transpile them and refresh the browser for us. Here we go, and our app is loaded. And so this is actually the template that I was showing you in the source code, and right here is where that property on the component is getting rendered on the page. If we go back and update that on our component and say, let's call this Coding Garden app, that will ultimately update because when this component renders, it's using the data from the component. Very cool. That was a bit of a whirlwind tour of the generated app. I am going to create a new component. We're going to use it inside the app. But yeah, any questions, thoughts, comments about this before we get into making some components? Cool. While you're thinking, I'm actually going to hook up Bootswatch to this so we can get some basic stylings. Okay, let's use Sandstone. So if you're not familiar with Bootswatch, if you've watched some of my videos, then you might be, because I use it all the time. Essentially, it's custom themes for Bootstrap. So if you're familiar with Bootstrap and Bootstrap classes, you can throw this CSS in, and you'll get some pretty awesome and pretty basic styles by default. So I can grab that CSS file, and then I'm just going to pop this into my index.html. So right in the head, I'll throw a link tag, throw that in, save it, and then let's add a navbar. So I want the code for this. And now in my app component, I'm going to get rid of everything and just add this navbar in. So let's essentially get rid of everything except the title. Let's say to-do app. And now there we go. So we got a basic app that has a navbar up top. One thing I'll do is create a component to hold this navbar. So right now I have my app component and I just have this code directly in there. I'm going to create a separate component, pull this template into it, and then use the component right here. Let's do that. So let's find the command to generate a component. Actually, I'm remembering now. So last time when I streamed to nobody, I could not find the command to generate a component. But if we do ng generate, there it is. Okay. ng generate component, and then you give it the name of the component. Before, I generated a component called app header, but when you generate a component, it automatically puts the word app in front of your component. So if I generate a component called header, it's actually going to be called app header. So I'll do that. And what this will do is we'll create a new folder inside of our app, create the component file, the template, the CSS, the tests, and the actual JavaScript, and then bring that component into the module. This is my longer break timer. Reach into the sky, look away from the screen, take a sip of water. Cool. So that generated that, and let's take a look at what we got. So now we have this header folder. It has all the component files inside of it. And if we look at, I believe, the app module, you'll notice that it's now bringing in, it automatically added this line to bring in the header component and then add its declaration. If we take a look at the header component TS file, we can see what its selector is. So it's app-header. So what I want to do is, where I put this nav, I actually want to pull that out, and then in the template for the header component, we're going to put it there. And now in the app component, I am going to say app-header, just like that. And it should work the same way, and it does, but now we've essentially pulled out that header part into its own component. Awesome. And as I mentioned, we're just building a basic to-do app, so let's create a new component for the to-do form. So let's do ng generate component to-do form. I'll take a look at my checklist to see how I'm doing. So we generated some components. Ultimately, I'm going to just use lots of components. Like in past to-do app tutorials, I kind of did everything in one component, like in Vue.js. But I am going to show the power of using all these different components in Angular to make stuff work. So generated a to-do form component. And essentially, we're just going to build out a form inside of here. So in here, I'm going to have a nice little form. That's a bit much. So these are essentially Bootstrap classes for creating a basic form. I'm going to say this is for new to do. The label is going to say new to do. And the placeholder is enter a to-do. Cool. And then we'll add a nice little submit button that says add to-do. Type is submit. So this component just defines a simple form, and when we generated it, it automatically got brought in as a declaration, so we can use it in another component. So in app.component, and actually if we look at this, we can see that the selector is app to do form. So in the HTML over here, right below the header, I'm going to throw that, and now we should get a nice little form, and we do. One thing I'll do though is like throw a main in there and give this a class of a container, so it kind of like pushes it in like that, and then I'll give some margin up top like 3, so it pushes it down just a little bit like that. Oh, not margin all, let's do margin top 3. Yeah, like that. Cool. So we got a basic form. Now let's make it so that when we type here and we click add, it logs something to the screen. So to do that, we could look at techniques, I think, or let's look at fundamentals and then forms, user input. And when I was initially looking at the Angular docs, I didn't like this because it reminded me a lot of React. Not that React is bad, that in that if I want to hook something up, I have to actually define the event listeners and then have code that automatically runs and updates a property when the event listener runs. I don't like doing that. But if you look at their docs initially, this is how it describes to do it. So for instance, let's say your template has an input box, and then right below that you want to show what the person is typing in this example here. So what they're doing is they're referencing the input by name and using its value inside of handlebars to actually render out that value. And then this example uses a key up where you have a property defined on the component, and in a key up, you're adding a value onto the property. I don't like this because I want my framework to do this for me. I don't want to have to type it all out. So ultimately, I did find that there is the forms module, I believe. Yeah, forms module. And this gives you ng model, which if you're familiar with Angular 1, automatically does two-way data binding on an input with some property on your component. So if we look up, I believe it's ng model. Overview, how to use, yeah, something like this. So once you've brought in the forms module, now your input can use this ng model syntax, set some property on the component, and that value will automatically be updated under the hood as the user types into the input box. Also, you're seeing the new syntax we use in Angular to create a binding. I believe the term they use is a banana in a box because it's squares and then it brackets with parentheses inside of it. I'm going to do my best to not talk about how much I hate it and just make the app work. So right below the modules here, you can bring in forms module, which is defined in the core library, and then you add this as an import. And by doing this, this makes the ng model directive available inside of your components. So now that I've done this, I can use this syntax. Aaron's asking what LaCroix I'm drinking. I'm not, but I think on my next break I'm going to go grab one. Right now, I'm just drinking some water in a teacup. But I have some passion fruit LaCroix in the fridge, which is probably my favorite flavor of LaCroix. That was a great detour, but back to the component. Essentially, in this form, as the user types into that input, I want them to update a value on my component as they're typing. So I can then use that value to add as a to-do in some other component. So here is where I'm going to use that ng model syntax. So here I'm going to say ng model, and instead of name, I'm going to call this new to-do. Now what this means is inside of this component, there should be a property called new to do. And as we type in this input, that property will automatically be updated. So on my component, I'm going to define a property. And notice this is a class. So I'm going to say new to do is a string. And its value initially is just an empty string. So when the component starts up, new to do will be empty. And as we start to type into this input, new to do is going to be updated with the value. And for whatever reason, I had a double form there. Get rid of that. And let's see this in action. So right below, I'm just going to add like an H3 and then just say new to do right there. So what should happen is as I type into this input box, we should see the latest value show up in that H3. Let's see what happens. Got some errors. Still got errors. Let's fix them. If ngModel is used within a form tag, either the name attribute must be set on the form. Okay, good call. So on this, I also need to give it a name of new to do. No errors. Moment of truth. LaCroix. Cool. So we went through all that trouble of bringing in the forms module, but now I can automatically bind this input to a property on my component. Very cool. Now let's, when we click this button, log the value to the console, because ultimately we're going to send that value somewhere else. Okay. I want to look for form submit. Actually, let's see if they used it on here. Yeah, so along with ngModel, you also get access to this ng submit, and we can add this to our form. So up top, I'm going to say ng submit. On submit will get called, and I have to define on submit in my component. So in to do form component, right here, I'm going to say on submit, and inside of here, I just want to log this dot new to do. So we should be able to log the value of the to do, or of the input box. So learn TypeScript, add to do, and we logged the value of the input. Very cool. I'm going to remove this H3. That was just for demonstration purposes. Let's get rid of that. Okay, cool. So we got a basic form. You can type in it. You can click submit. We get access to the value. Let's work on some other things. So we have the form. Now I also want a list, so where I'm going to show all of the to-dos. So in my to-do app, I am going to generate another component and call it to-do list. Cool. We got all our files. Notice to-do list component was brought in as a declaration. We now have this folder, and we have a place where we can list all of our to-dos. So let's look at the docs for a list group. I'm going to go to Bootstrap. Is it Jose? Not sure how to say your name, but you are Bradford. Jocelyn. Yes, that's it, right? Hello. Bradford says, I'm the most excellent human. I appreciate it. Got a little sidetracked there. Let's keep moving. So I'm looking for a list group. And basically, I want to have a list below the form that looks like this, so we can show all of our to-dos. So let's bring that in right there. And ultimately, I want this one list item to be repeated for every item in our to-do array. So on the to-do list component, I am going to define an array of to-dos. Even Bradford. Okay, so on the component, I'm going to say, let's call this to-dos, and this is going to be an array of to-do item, and initially, it's just an empty array. And so, just like we saw earlier in my TypeScript example, I'm going to define an interface called to-do item. So let's do that in just the app folder. So I'm going to call this to-do item.ts. And this is going to be an interface called to-do item that has a title of type string and is done of type boolean. And we're going to do export default interface. So I define an interface, call to do item. This describes an object that will have a title that is a string and is done that is a boolean. Believe the syntax is like that. Cool. And so now I'm going to bring this interface into my to-do list component so that I can define this property being an array of to-do item. So let's bring that in. I'm going to import to-do item from, go up one directory and grab the to-do item file. Cool. And let's just do this. So when this component is initialized, we're going to push into this array. Title is learn TypeScript. And is done is false. And this should be this.todos. So initially the component's to-dos property is an empty array, and then when it gets initialized, we push an object into that array. Fantastic. Now we want to show all of the items in this array in our view right here. And this is where ng4 comes into play. So let's take a look at that. In the Angular docs, ng4, I think that's what it's called. Let's look at tutorial displaying a list. Yes, ng4. And so essentially, this is the syntax, and let's use it. So we'll say that there, and ultimately, I want to repeat this list item for every to-do in to-dos. And so to-dos should be a property on our component, and if we look at the TypeScript, it is. And so this says for every to-do inside of that array, give it the name to-do, and then we can access it inside of this element. So I'll do to-do.title. So when this component loads, it's going to essentially iterate over that array and create a list item for every to-do object inside of that array. Cool. Let's check it out. And it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? Oh, we need to put the to-do list actually in our app. So right here we have the form, but below that we need to add the to-do list right there. Cool. And there it is. Sweet. So ultimately, it's repeating over that array and showing a list item for everything inside of the array. Very cool. I'm going to give this a little bit of styling. So let's say this has a margin top of 2, just so it pushes the list down a little bit. A little bit. Why not? That should work. Margin top 5. It's not working, and I don't know why. That's fine. We'll look at it later. Okay, cool. So I've got a form. I've got a list. Now we kind of want to connect these two things together. So when I click add, ultimately we need to send whatever they typed into the form somewhere so that it can then get pushed into the array and show up. Show up in the view right here. To do this, we need to use something called an input. First an output. Okay, cool. So let's look at outputs. If you're familiar with React or Vue.js, ultimately inputs and outputs are props. They're a way of sending data down to a component or calling or emitting some event or calling some function or emitting some event to a parent component. But with Angular, you have to be explicit about it. And so to essentially call something in an outer component, we use an output. Let's look at an example. Server-side rendering, master detail components maybe. Add the input. I don't see output listed anywhere on here. Output. Component interaction. Yes, pass data from parent to child with input binding. So ultimately, I guess I think I'll do this first. So because the array is defined inside of the to-do list, it would be really hard for the form to trigger some event in the to-do list, which is at the same level as it. So ultimately, what we want to do is bring that array back up to this top level component, pass the array down to this component, and then whenever we want to add something to that array, we'll fire an output or trigger an event in the top level component. I don't like the fact that I'm using so many words and not explaining them, but ultimately this is how complicated Angular 5 is. It introduces a lot of new concepts, some new syntax, lots of new files. I don't like it at all. Just use Vue.js, but it's fun. We're here, we're learning it. Let's keep doing it. Basically, I want to move this array of to-dos to my top level component here. So I'm going to do that. And then we'll do the same, push it into the array in on init. So let's copy this, get rid of that. And so on our top level component, we're going to want ng on init. But if you want a component to use on init, you'll notice that it needs to implement on init, which is brought in from Angular core. So we'll do that on the top level component. We'll say implements on init, and then we'll also bring in on init from Angular core. The other thing is, because we're using this to do item interface, we need to pull that out of here and use it right there. Cool. We'll actually get it from the same directory. Okay, so ultimately what we've done is we've pulled that array into the top component, and now we want to pass that array down to the list component so that it can actually iterate over that array. For that, we're going to use an input. And so we'll do that like this. And on the component right here, I believe we have to bring in input from Angular core. Go back. Cool. So we're going to bring in input. And basically our input is going to be to-dos, and it's going to be an array of to-do item. And I guess we actually do need the to-do item interface in this file as well. So I'm going to import to-do item from to-do item up one directory. Yeah. So what this says is this component itself does not have an array, but it's accepting an array of to-do items as an input so that it can be used inside of its component. And because we give it the name to-dos inside the template, this still makes sense. But now we need to pass that array down to this list component. So if we look in our app component, here is where we want to pass that array down, because this app component is a part of this, which actually has the to-dos defined, and we want to pass that down. So let's see how they pass it down. Quick break timer. I am going to run and get a passion fruit LaCroix. Stay right there. Hello? Cool. Yeah? Look at that. That's good. Okay. So now the syntax to pass that array down to the list component. You'll notice right here it's using the bracket syntax. And so basically what we need to do is say to-dos is equal to to-dos. So this is the name of the input inside of the component. And so we named the input to-dos. And then this is the name of the property on this component, which is to-dos. And so now this is passing that data down to this component, and it should just work like before, and it does. So we're still iterating over the array, but now we're actually defining the array in a parent component and just passing that data down. Whew. Okay, that was fun. Now we need to use outputs. Let's see if this tutorial has anything on outputs. Output. Okay. Parent listening for a child event. So ultimately, here's what needs to happen. In our form, here, when they submit the form, we want to emit an event that says, hey, the form was submitted. Here is the value that was entered into the form. And then in our top level component, we'll be listening for that event. And when that event happens, we're going to push a new to-do into the array using the value that was emitted. Okay, let's make it happen. So we need an output defined on our, wait, where are we at? Output, please, here. So we're going to define an output on the form component. So on the to-do form, we'll bring in output. And here we're going to describe our output. We'll say at output is going to be, we'll say on new to do. And this is going to be a new event emitter of type string. And I need to bring in event emitter from also Angular core. So I'll bring that in up here. And so ultimately what we're saying is we will have this output defined, which someone else can listen for, and this output will emit a string. And in this case, we're emitting the item from the form, which itself is a string. Cool. So that's defined there. Now we need to actually call it. So inside of our submit function, we're going to say this.onNewToDo.emit, and we're going to emit this.newToDo. Whoa, something's happening. Like that. Okay. So ultimately, when they submit this form, we emit this onToDo event with the value of the form, and then whoever is listening for that event will get access to what we emitted and can do something with it. So now we need to listen for that event. So now in the parent component, we can do something like this. So if we look at app component.html, now on our form, we want to say on new to do is going to be on new to do with the event value. And so basically this is the output that's defined on the form. And then this is going to be a method that we define inside of our top level component. So in app.component, we'll create a method called onNewToDo. This is going to take in the new to do, which is a string. And we are then going to push that to do into the array with the new to do as the title and done as false. And because we're now doing that, I'm going to get rid of the initial pushing into the array. So when the app starts up, it should just be an empty array. Cool. But if I've done everything correctly, this should work. So let's kind of review what's happening here. So the form defines this output called onNewToDo, and whenever that event is emitted, it's going to call the onNewToDo function method in this component, which gets access to newToDo and then can do what it wants. In this case, we're pushing it into the array. But if we look back at the form, we've defined this output to be an event emitter. And when the form is submitted, we essentially emit that event with the value that was inside of the form. Whew. Okay, if we've done it right, This should work. Learn TypeScript. It works. Learn Angular 5. Boom. Learn. Don't learn Angular 5. Don't learn TypeScript. Cool. It's working. So ultimately, we have this top level component where the data exists. It is sending the data down to our list component. The top level component is listening for an event from the form component. When it emits an event, we can then push into the array, which then, because it's bound, is passed down to the list component. It did the thing. It really did. And this is exhausting. Like, I could do the same thing in Vue.js in like 5 minutes. Ultimately, Angular 5 is definitely attractive to people that have been doing enterprise development and you're used to typing everything and you're used to like large build processes and stuff like that. But I like writing just code that actually does things rather than like boilerplate code like this and all of this. I don't know. I have opinions. Okay. I have been streaming for about an hour, I believe. So I think one thing I want to do is add some functionality here. So something like we have like a done button, and when we click done, it will mark this thing as done. Hopefully I can get that to work. I've never done it before. Let's figure it out. And then maybe even a delete button on here. When we click delete, it removes it from the array and removes it from the list. All right, let's make it happen. So in the to-do list here, we also want to show a button before the title. So let's just do a button delete, or let's say remove. We'll do button danger, which is a bootstrap thing for a red button. What do we get? Learn TypeScript. Now we get this fancy remove button. And so what I want to happen is when I click remove, we should remove this element from the array. And also, while I'm thinking about it, the form should clear out whenever we submit, and that's easy enough. If we go back to the form, in the submit event, we can just say this.new to do equals the empty string. And now automatically, when the form is submitted, it will blank out the input. So I can say learn TypeScript, empty. Learn Angular 5. Just learn Vue. Cool. And so yeah, let's try to get these buttons working. So ultimately, I am gonna need an output, because if you remember, this component does not have direct access to the array. It's getting it passed down as an input. And so when I click this button, we want to emit an event that says remove this element from the array. Let's do that. So now let me close everything real quick. That and that. And yeah, so now our list component needs to define an output that is on remove out item. So let's define an output. Here we're going to say at output, we'll say on remove to do. And this, let's see how we defined it in the form. Yeah, it's an event emitter. So here we're going to say equals new event emitter. And ultimately, I believe we can emit the index of the item we want to remove from the array. So that's what we'll do. We need to bring in event emitter from Angular core. And now we need a remove method. So let's have a remove to do that accepts the index. And right now we're just going to log the index. Cool. And then on the component, we essentially want the click event to call remove to do with this index. I'm just going to guess. Is it on click? I don't know. I might have to go look at the docs. Let's see. Well, it didn't complain. Learn TypeScript. Go. Remove. Nothing happened. Okay. Let's go look up our click event. Click. Yeah, should be, oh, just click, not on click. Learn TypeScript. Remove. Okay, and so now it's attempting to log the index, but we aren't actually passing that in. Let's look at ng4, because I want to see if we can actually get access to why is this so hard to find? Frequently used modules, displaying here, like, ultimately, I want to get access to the current index of the element in the ng4. In Angular 1, this was $index. Is it the same? Let's see. If not, I'm going to have to figure it out. Okay. Learn TypeScript. Add. Remove. Still undefined. Okay. I'm just going to search it on the Googles. Angular 5 ng4 get index. ng4 syntax. ng4 with index as value in attribute. Oh, interesting. Let I equal index. Okay, let's try it. So let to do of to dos, let I equals index, and then we're going to just pass in I right there. And so in our component, let's say this is a number. Hopefully we get access to the index right there. Let's see. Learn TypeScript. Go. Remove. Index 0. Very cool. Okay, so remove to do is passing in the index. We now want to emit the onRemoveToDo event. So we'll do this dot onRemoveToDo dot emit index. And now we need to listen for that event in the parent component. So in our app component here, we want to basically listen for on remove to do. And then we'll define a method in our app component called onRemoveToDo. So in here, we'll have onRemoveToDo that takes in the index, which is a number. And we essentially just want to splice the array. So this dot todos dot splice at index. Please take away one of them. Is that going to work? If it works, that's great. Angular 5, go. Learn TypeScript. Go. Drink LaCroix. Go. All right, moment of truth. It works. Okay. I'm gonna take a sip of LaCroix. Okay, let's review what's happening there. Okay. So in our top component, we have this function that accepts an index and then just removes that to do from the array using that index. In the template, we're binding the output of the to-do list, which is this remove function, to the method in our component, which ultimately will get called with the index. Okay. And then in the to-do list on the component, we've defined this output as onRemoveToDo, and it is an event emitter that emits a number. I guess I didn't mention this earlier, but in TypeScript, this is like generic syntax. An event emitter can emit something of any type, and so whatever type you're emitting goes inside of these less than and greater than sign. But ultimately, this event is emitting a number because it's emitting the index of the element we clicked the remove button on. Cool. And then in our template, inside of this ng4, each button gets access to the current index. And so when we click it, we'll call that method, which emits the event, which then gets called in the parent component. Cool. Cool. Okay. We've got our remove button. Last thing, we'll add an isDone button, which will set the isDone property on the to-do to be true, because by default it is false. So that'll set it to true, and then we can use class binding syntax to like show a line through the to-do when it's actually done. So let's do that. So learn TypeScript, learn Angular 5. Now we want to show a button that says done on there. So in the to-do list, right here, let's add a button. We'll say done. Let's see what kind of button we get. It's blue. Let's do success. I think that's green. Yeah. And so when we click done, we want to basically show a line through the item. So let's first just hook up a click event. So right here, we're going to say when this is clicked, we will mark done with the, well, actually, I should just be able to say to-do.isDone equals true. Okay, maybe that'll work. But one thing I want to do is conditionally render this button. So if the to-do is done, then we don't want to show the done button because it's already done. So is there an ngIf or an ngIf? How do I use it? Star ngIf. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to say ngIf to-do.isDone not. So if the to-do is not done, show this button, but if it is done, hide the button. So when we click it, if it does set this property, then we know that the click is working and the ngIf is working. So learn Angular 5. If we mark it as done, it works because the button disappeared. Okay, let's also conditionally render some styles or a class. Is there an ng class? Yeah. Cool. So the idea here is we can add a class to this element if some expression evaluates to true. So here's what I want to do. On this list item, I want to add the isDone class. Let's call it like to-do done. How's this working? Yeah, so let's say to-do done if to-do.isDone. So if this to-do is done, apply the to-do done class to that element. Let's see if it works. We're going to say learn Angular 5. Go. Let's look at our dev tools to see if this class gets added. If I click done, ng class object, that didn't work. Let's see what we got to do. Do I have to do anything special to use ng class? Import ng class from Angular common? Let me see. If we look in our app module, we are bringing in ng module. I'm going to Google it. I'm going to say Angular 5 ng class. Could watch a video on it, or can we just set it up? I might actually use the ng style binding because that way I won't have to apply a class. Let's just try that real quick. So I could do ng style. I want to apply the text decoration in the value. Wait. No. Show me ng class. Yeah, this should work. Because we have the class on the left-hand side, and I'm defining it as an object, and then the right-hand side is an expression. It could be because this class is actually, it could be because it's on the list item itself, so it doesn't have access to the to-do. Let's do this. Let's have inside of here just a span, and we'll put that on there, and then we'll throw the title inside of a span. Okay, let's see what happens. So learn Angular 5. Let's inspect this element. It's saying object, which to me, it's not interpreting this as an actual expression. We can also set class on an element by binding to the input property, binding called class, like so. Important. We're bringing in ng module and component. I don't see anything special. Okay. If I click done. Oh, well, yeah, it's working. Okay. So the class is getting applied to do done. Weird. Okay. It's working. Maybe it was working before too. Now I actually need to define this class. So in here, I'm going to say the to do done class has a text decoration of line through. And now, learn Angular 5. Done. Line through. We did it. We did it. Learn TypeScript. Add. Done. Learn about modules. Learn things all day. Go. Done. Done. Remove. All right. I have done it. I have built an Angular 5 app with minimal complaining and sort of explaining what I'm doing while I did it. Hopefully this was helpful to you. Any last comments, questions, thoughts in the chat before I end the live stream for tonight? Let's get rid of that. Cool. So I am just going to do one last quick review of all the things I did to build out this Angular app. So we'll start at app.module. So this is kind of the entry point for the whole application. This is where we bring in all of our components, especially our top-level app component, and all the other components that we defined. And if we look at our top-level component, you'll notice that it has a selector app root. So if we're using this component inside of our app, this is the element name that we would use. Every component has a template and styles associated with it. In our case, the template for this component has the app header up top, the form, and then the list down below. And also on that component, we've defined some properties. So, well, we're not using the title, but this component has an array of to-dos. That array, each object inside of it implements the to-do item interface. we defined that interface as just an object that has a title property that's a string and an isDone property that's a Boolean. So the array is defined there. Then in the template, we bring in the to-do form, which is another component we created, and we have an output on that component. So let's take a look at that component. This one has a selector of app to-do form, so that's how we actually bring it into our app. And this component has a property called new to-do that ultimately is bound to the input. So as the user types new to-do in this component is going to get updated with the latest value that the user has typed. All right. And then when this form is submitted, we take the value that the user had entered and we emit an event with that value. So this component defines this output on new to-do that ultimately will pass the value to whoever is listening for this event. And then we blank out the form. And then if we look at the top level component, you'll notice that this component is listening with this method on new to-do. So this corresponds to the method defined here. And whenever this method gets called, it gets passed in the to-do that the user had typed in. We then push a new object into the to-dos array, and that automatically gets shown on the view because we pushed it into the array. Awesome. If we're looking at this, we also see that the to-do list has two things here. First thing is we're passing down the array of to-dos to the to-do list. So the to-do list defines an input of to-dos, and that basically says I'm accepting an array of to-dos from the outside world. And inside of the component, we iterate over that array of to-dos using ng-for. So basically we say, for every to-do in the to-dos array, we're going to show this list item that has a done button, a remove button, and then the actual title of the to-do itself. Okay. When a to-do is marked as done, we have a click handler on this that sets the internal isDone property of that to-do to true, and then hides the button if isDone is true. And then to remove a to-do, we call the remove to-do method when this button is clicked in this component and pass in the index here. And this component also defines an output because we want to be able to alert our parent component that, hey, we want to remove a to-do with this index because we don't have direct access to the array here. It was passed down to us. So we define this output that says we're going to be emitting an event that contains a number. And when this function is called, it actually emits that event. And if we look over here, we're essentially listening for that event on the method in this component called onRemoveToDo. And in the top level component, this method's defined, it accepts the index, and then we just splice that value out of, well, that index out of the array when the remove button is clicked. Whew. That is our Angular app. This has been an introduction to TypeScript and Angular 5. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for everyone who tuned in and was in the chat. If you're watching later, throw a comment. I am going to put the link to this code in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I believe my next live stream will for sure be next Monday at 8:20 p.m. Mountain Time. I may do one before then. I haven't decided yet. Just be on the lookout for a message on YouTube. All right. There I am. Look at me. And here's this. Awesome. Thanks again for watching. See you next time.